When we think about terrorism, our minds almost always jump to violence, to conflict, to ideology. But what if there's a huge piece of the puzzle that we're missing? Today, we're going to look past the headlines and dig into the cold, hard economic logic that so often drives these terrible acts. So, let's just start with that big question. Is terrorism really just about extremism and creating chaos? For most of us, that's the story we're told. But is it the whole story? Well, it turns out no. Behind the violence, there is often a very calculated, almost business-like strategy at play. A strategy where the main goal is to get the biggest possible bang for the absolute lowest buck. All right, let's get into it. At its very core, for a lot of these groups, terrorism is a calculation. It's a grim but very real kind of cost-benefit analysis. A small group will literally sit down and ask three simple but incredibly powerful questions. First, how much is this attack actually going to cost us? In resources, people, money. Second, how much attention and fear is this going to generate? And third, how much pressure will the public then put on the government to react? And this right here, this captures the entire strategy in one go. If the cost of an attack is low, but the political and economic shockwave it creates is massive, well, that attack suddenly becomes a very, very attractive option for a weaker group trying to challenge a much stronger state. So, how does this actually play out in the real world? Well, this brings us to something military strategists call asymmetric warfare. A really clear example of this is in the long-running conflict between India and Pakistan, especially when you look at the Kashmir region. For decades, we've seen small, mobile, militant groups used as strategic tools. See, instead of fighting an incredibly expensive conventional war, a state might use a smaller, less formal group to create instability, and all for a tiny fraction of the cost. And this perfectly illustrates that economic imbalance. For the attacking side, the expense is pretty limited, but for the defending nation, the response is astronomically expensive. We're talking more troops, more intelligence, constant high-alert readiness. A single, relatively small attack can force billions in long-term security spending. We see a very similar economic equation playing out in the Middle East, particularly in the conflict involving Hamas and Israel. Think about it. On one side, you have weapons like relatively cheap, often homemade rockets, or tunnels dug with basic tools. But on the defending side, you have a multi-billion-dollar, super high-tech missile defense system. A cheap weapon forces an incredibly costly defense. That's the essence of this whole economic strategy. So, this all begs a pretty important question. What kind of places allow this strategy to even work? Well, the answer often lies in the economics of instability. In places with weak or failing governments, think Sudan during certain periods of its history, you get a perfect storm. The government can't provide basic security or justice. The chances of getting caught for a crime are low. And, maybe most importantly, there are very few legitimate ways to make a living. For young people facing unemployment, joining an armed group can start to look like a viable career choice. And in these regions, terrorism and militia activity don't just exist on their own. They actually become part of what's called a shadow economy. These groups fund themselves by controlling smuggling routes, getting into illegal trade, and even forcing the local population to pay them taxes. They become a kind of parallel, illicit economic power. Which brings us to a really crucial point. If you want to understand how these groups operate, you absolutely have to follow the money. Terrorist financing is almost never from just one place. It's more like a diversified portfolio. Money flows in from all over. Individual donations, diaspora networks, that's supporters living in other countries, criminal activities like smuggling or kidnapping for ransom, and sometimes even covert support from other governments, using the group to push their own agenda. And here's the bottom line. Money is the lifeblood. You can have the most passionate, extreme ideology in the world, but without a steady stream of cash to pay your fighters, buy weapons, and run your operations, your organization just isn't going to survive. It's that simple. Okay, so now let's flip the coin and look at the other side of this, the immense economic damage that terrorism causes a society. And believe me, it goes way beyond the immediate physical destruction. See, the real goal of terrorism isn't to win a battle on a field. It's to create economic and psychological chaos. After a major attack, tourism, which is often a vital industry, just plummets. Foreign investors get nervous and pull their money out. Insurance costs go through the roof. And of course, the government is forced to pour staggering amounts of money into security.
And this right here, this shows you the hidden cost. It's the opportunity cost. Every single dollar or rupee or shekel that gets funneled into surveillance, checkpoints, and military hardware is money that can't be spent on building schools, funding hospitals, or investing in roads. So the public ends up paying the price twice.
So let's pull all of this together. From South Asia to the Middle East to fragile states in Africa, this economic pattern is surprisingly consistent. Terrorism as a strategy survives and it thrives under three conditions: when the cost to the attacker is low, when the political shockwave is high, and, crucially, when their financial networks are left intact. What this all means is that any real, effective solution has to be more than just military force. If the problem is partly economic, then the solution has to be economic too. It means we have to dismantle those financial networks, strengthen governments so they can provide real economic opportunities, and ultimately raise the economic cost of choosing violence. Because in the end, if we really want to get a handle on this global challenge, we have to remember this one final thought. Terrorism isn't just a security problem. It is, fundamentally, also an economic one.